Let's talk about dopamine. So, dopamine, you've probably heard of it. You may not know exactly what it does. It's a neurotransmitter found kind of at the back of the brain, area called the midbrain. And it does two things that are quite interesting to us. So, the first one is what you've probably heard of before. It's known most widely because of its association with pleasure. Usually you hear it referred to when people are talking about drug addiction and alcohol addiction, where dopamine is released after you take the drug or drink the alcohol, and it makes you want more of that thing. And that's kind of one of the things that it does do. It does it in a very specific way. So anything that feels good for your body, your brain will release dopamine as a means of storing that as a memory. So anything that's good, it says, all right, how did I get that? How do I get more of it? I'm going to remember everything that I did so that I can then do those things again in the future, because it's likely to produce a favorable outcome for me. So that can be quite useful in our training, because if we want to improve our memory, if we want to remember the skills that we're trying, it's probably a good idea if we can have a dopamine release so that the memories are stored a little bit more easily. Now, there's another function of dopamine which is, for me, almost a little more interesting, and that is that it is released also in anticipation of reward. So you do something good, dopamine will be released to make you want to do more of that thing. It also gets released when your brain predicts that something good is about to happen. And not that it has happened, but that it's about to. And when it's released, then it gives you just a little bit more energy, a little bit more motivation, a little bit more drive to go and get that thing, because it knows if you had a little bit more energy, you might achieve your goal a little bit easier. And that goal is going to be something that's good for you. So what are the effects? I've kind of talked about that a little bit already, but increased movement is one. So in this anticipation of reward idea, your body will improve your strength a little bit so that you can achieve the things you want to do. It will also improve your coordination, your balance. With all of those things, we'll then see an improvement in range of motion. So these are all things that we really might want as circus practitioners: increased balance, strength, range of motion, coordination. It seems having dopamine in our system is probably going to be a good thing for our performance and for our learning of skills. The next one is memory formation. So like I said, when you do the good thing, it plays a key role in connecting with the hippocampus, which is the memory center in our brain, to say, all of those things that I just did, I want you to remember those things so that I can do it again. So again, really useful in our training. If we do something that feels good and is great, then dopamine will help make sure it gets solidified into a memory. Next up, we've got improved focus and attention. So this is more, again, in the anticipation of the reward. It's going to make you concentrate a little harder on one thing, rather than in your normal state, you kind of sit back and have a slightly more relaxed view. You want to be able to take in anything that might be important. When dopamine is released, it's usually because you've decided something is important, and now your energy needs to be focused on that one aspect. Increased motivation, pretty much the same thing. So anticipation of reward, you feel like you want to get the thing. I won't dwell too much on that. The same thing goes for energy levels. So the energy levels will pick up, increase, probably as a byproduct of all the rest, especially the increased movement. The other really interesting thing is pain processing becomes a little bit better. So you will find that your body will ignore pain signals that it doesn't think are useful at the time. So it still won't ignore the actual signals of danger, but we'll get into it in the next slide. Sometimes your body will fire pain signals if it thinks it's better to err on the side of caution. When dopamine's released, it's to get something that's about to arrive. You kind of ignore that for just a little bit. So on the other side of things, what are the deficits? And really, you can imagine this is just the opposite of everything that we've talked about. So lethargy, boredom, decreased focus, apathy, fatigue. Most of those words are kind of the same thing, but really the message is the same. When you're not going about doing something that's going to have a positive effect on your body will try to shut you down. It doesn't want you doing those things. It will make you tired. It will make you bored. You won't be able to focus as well. You'll have to fight against it to consciously overcome it. Your energy levels will drop to a point where you are properly tired. And then on the flip side to what we mentioned before, pain tolerance goes down. So your body will allow pain signals to transmit, because anything that you're doing, it doesn't think is worthwhile anyway. So if you had a historic injury site, or if you just have areas that generally tend to get sore, it's going to be much happier about making those things sore to prevent you doing stuff that isn't really in its best interest. So from those two slides, you can probably see I'm going to be voting in favor of having more dopamine in your system when you're trying to learn. So how does this affect our training? Number one, you want to set goals. So if you've got a goal in mind, if you actually have an idea of what you want to accomplish and what you want to achieve, your frontal cortex, that's the part at the front of your brain where all your conscious decision-making takes place, it's going to know, I achieved that, so that will allow for the release of dopamine. So if we take, for example, your handstand, if you kick up to a handstand and your goal is just to hold it for as long as you possibly can, unless you break a record, which isn't going to happen very often in your training, you're not going to get that dopamine release. If you say, I'm going to hold a handstand for 10 seconds, well, after the 10 seconds, if it's something that's achievable for you, you then get the dopamine release. That helps store all the actions that you just did in memory, helps it to become a habit. So setting goals is a much better idea than always trying to just perform your best, or not having a clear idea of what you want to achieve. And that's not to say you're not going to do that ever. It's a good idea to explore as well sometimes. But most of the time, you want to say what you're going to do before you do it, because the more you're achieving things or nearly achieving things, remember this works in anticipation of reward as well, the more times in that training session you're going to get that dopamine release. So the second point, this is that most work should be done in the flow state and not in the state of deliberate practice. That's a little bit tricky. I'll try and explain why nice and quickly, but the idea of the flow state is one where you feel fully engaged in what you're doing. Everything is just a little bit challenging. It's kind of at that edge of difficulty where you can achieve all of it, but it's just a little bit challenging for you, so you stay interested. And that interest is probably the result of dopamine and some other neurotransmitters just constantly flowing into your system because it likes what's happening and it wants it to keep going on. That's a bit contrary to what has kind of been said in the past, that if you want to be world class at something, if you really want to be the best, deliberate practice is the best way forwards. Deliberate practice being you're going to spend all of your time focusing on the flaws, on the things that are not correct with what you're doing. And the only way you're going to get good at the fastest level is to concentrate on those things. There's a little bit of debate in this, a little bit of wiggle room, because as you get better and better at a thing, at a skill, deliberate practice is going to start becoming more fun. So that the act of figuring out the little things that would make you better is going to start to be enjoyable. So soon the deliberate practice and the flow state are actually going to start to merge and cross over slightly. So it's not to say that we don't do deliberate practice ever. You always want to be trying to figure out what are the small things that you could be improving, but you don't want to be doing it to the detriment of your enjoyment. And that's really the key point there. The next thing is to collect data. So this is really helpful. If you're going to set goals, it's probably a good idea for you to know what goals are actually achievable. I could say I want to hold a 30-second handstand, but if I'm nowhere near that and it wasn't actually a reasonable outcome, I'll still get the dopamine if I get there, but if I never get there, the dopamine isn't going to get released. So collecting data on anything that you can quantify. So how many reps could I do, or how long can I hold this for, is probably a good idea, and collecting it over a long time period so that you can see your rate of improvement. If I know that I improve my handstand hold average of a training session improves by 2 seconds every week, let's just say, then I know come Monday, I want to add 2 seconds to the time that I'm expecting to hold. And that's probably not that unreasonable. And over time that might change again. But if you're always collecting the data, if you're always writing it down somewhere, you'll be able to work that out a little bit easier. Next thing is adding challenge to warm-ups. This is more to do with how we approach things like warm-ups and how we approach things like basic skills. A lot of the time people just have a warm-up that they do and they're happy that it's all about, I just move the joints that are going to move and that's it. It's worth noting that you might get more out of it if you add a little bit of novelty. So if you're having to pay attention, whether that's by playing a game, you might be putting specific movements that you don't normally do on your joints. As long as you're paying attention, you're more likely to get a bit of a dopamine release. And remember, one of the things dopamine does is give you better strength output, balance, energy, range of motion, focus. Those are all things you probably want from the very start of your training session. So if you're doing anything that's going to facilitate its release in your warm-up, that can't be a very bad thing. And then similarly, regressing skills. This is, if we take an example of a backflip, a lot of the times in gymnastics, we think of a back handspring, a backflip as one of the basic skills. So the way we're going to learn it is we're just going to practice it over and over until it works. Or maybe we'll do it with a spot over and over until it works. And that's another conversation of whether a spot can really give you some good feedback on what you're doing. But actually, if we can figure out ways to work only around skills that we are nearly attaining, rather than the ones that are very far away, we're probably going to get the dopamine release more often. So in the instance of a back handspring, rather than looking at drills like getting the perfect takeoff and then doing lots of handstand hops and things like that, maybe the approach taken in things like capoeira, where you learn something like a macaco, where you go over one shoulder, a little bit to the side, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, and eventually that leads into jumping, could be a smarter way to go, because you've already decided what you're doing and you can then learn it in the process. So if you've decided you're going over your shoulder, then you do it, it works, dopamine release, remember the skill a little bit sooner, a little bit faster, and then move on to the next thing. And then the final point, again, it's another version of the warm-ups. Keep your basics varied. So we definitely don't dispute that constant drilling of basic skills is a good idea. But if you're doing it to the point where your brain switches off, just the same as in the warm-up, actually you're getting those switched off feelings, you're getting the boredom, you're getting the fatigue, specifically because the dopamine's not getting released, nothing's being challenged, and your brain's not remembering anything. So you might be the kind of person who can just drill basics over and over and constantly spot tiny differences in what you're doing, and that might be interesting to you. If it is, then great. That's probably a good strategy for you. If you can't tell the difference between 2 forward rolls or two hawk speeds, you probably want to try something different. So for the forward rolls, is it you're going to throw and catch something? Could you throw something in the hawk speed against the wall? Could you reach to different points as you do it? Could you try doing it with your eyes closed, looking in different directions? Keep adding the variation so that your brain's still interested in what it's doing as it goes. if we want to take this a little bit further, there's a couple of things we can think about in terms of teaching as well. So if we do have to teach this to another person, or if you want to think of your learning from the other side, the other angle, think first of all about building confidence before you decide to teach tricks. So what I mean by that is the first couple of skills that you give to people should be achievable. You want them to get the reward first before they get the challenge. And the reason for that is you want the dopamine to get released. Your brain isn't going to anticipate a reward if it didn't know there was one coming. So if you choose something that was much too hard for a person, that's one way to just kill their motivation, get them switched off. If you choose a couple of tasks that are easily achievable first, even if they're ridiculously easily achievable, and then build from there, you're probably going to get more buy-in from people. You're probably going to get more dopamine released from everybody. And once it's released, motivation is going to be higher, so you can start challenging them with more difficult skills. The same as in the training tools, you want to randomize the tasks as much as possible, not just for dopamine. There's a lot of studies that suggest trying things with variation actually has a much better effect long term, not so much in the short term, of improving learning. So they've had tests where they have people throw a ball at certain points on a tennis court or into a bucket, and some people practiced it from the same position every single time for 3 weeks. Some people practiced it where they had to stand in a different position every single time. After the 3-week period, the people who had practiced different positions actually had a higher success rate of throwing the ball into the bucket at the distance that the other people had just continually practiced. So randomizing and varying tasks, as well as keeping it interesting and novel, and probably for that reason, is going to be a good idea too. The next one is to set individual specific goals. So either you as a teacher are setting the goals for the student, or you're asking the student to set their own goals and not to accept if they can't give you a clear idea of what they want to achieve. And like I said before, that's not what you want to do the whole time. Sometimes it's about play and exploration and just seeing, oh, what is this? But then based on that information, once you've gathered that data, you want to ask them to set their own goals or set the goals yourself and see what you can achieve. Encouraging modification. So that's just going back to the idea of regressing skills as much as possible. If something isn't working, it's probably not a good idea to encourage people to keep trying that thing. That's only going to get rid of the motivation. You want to try and tweak things and change things. At the very least, it means if it doesn't work, it's still keeping the brain engaged in the novelty. So it's probably a good idea to change things, let's say a couple of tries, and if it's not working, it's got to change. It's not a just keep doing that moment. And then the final one is just look for signs of frustration in students. So all of those signs of the growling, sighing, just looking generally bored is usually a sign that there's not a lot of dopamine in the system. You want to get them out of that state, and just, even if it means changing the exercise totally, you want to get them into the habit of doing the fun thing, having them enjoy their training, which shouldn't sound so strange. It should be, everybody should enjoy doing the training that they're doing, whether it's at the recreational level or the professional level, because that will have the better benefits. So in summary, dopamine released upon their success of a skill also helps form memories after you achieve the skill, and it can really affect your energy, your mood, your memory formation, your movement quality, your tolerance to pain. All of these things are things that we really want when we're training. So we should always look to be trying to maximize the dopamine release in our system. This can be increased through challenge and novelty. So the more variation and things like that we add to our training, the better. So there we go. That's thoughts on dopamine. Thank you very much.